field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing the song and the carrying sign, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people sweet in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I'm very pleased to have with me tonight my guest, who is Chuck Collins. How you doing, Chuck?
Hi, Lauren. Good to be with you.
Yes, I want to let people know that Chuck is in Guilford, Vermont right now, where there's a power outage. Chuck is the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. He is also co-founder of Wealth for the Common Good. Before we talk about your latest report, which is Billionaire Bonanza 2020, I'd like to discuss your background. In your 2016 book, Born on Third Base, a one percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. You wrote how you, although you were the great-grandson of Oscar Mayer, the founder of the hot dog company, and you inherited $500,000 when you were 26, which you promptly gave away. You wrote about how you were brought up with a social conscience. So talk about your background and how it influenced your life and your work.
Well, I think, Lauren, as you said, I grew up born on third base, and I had this experience of kind of seeing the inequalities we're living through from a very kind of intimate front row seat. I saw both wealth at the top multiplying, but one of my first jobs was working with tenants in mobile home parks, trying to purchase and control their lives and own their parks themselves. So I just sort of felt like I saw how these inequalities were playing out in people's lives very specifically. But yeah, I was fortunate. My parents, I think, had a sense of fairness and justice. My mom did not grow up in a wealthy family. She was very much kind of had a working class sensibility, grew up in Lime, Ohio. So I felt, I heard her commentary about society, as we went along. I also should say I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, and it's very hard to ignore, even starting at the age of 7, the tremendous gap between downtown Detroit and where we lived in the suburbs, the racial wealth divide, and what it was like to crisscross that cavernous inequality between Detroit and the suburbs. So that very much affected me too.
But your parents instilled in you certain values. Also, you had to do work, chores, things like that.
Yeah, I think there was always an expectation that I would work, that I would, I had my jobs around the house and around the farm, and starting at the age of 7. So, I think that was important. Something that, as a parent, it's not that easy to do. Now I appreciate that that's not always the easiest thing to enforce. Yeah, and I think there was a sense that, too much inequality, too big of a gap would be bad for even us, that we didn't want to live in a society that had too big of a gap between rich and everyone else.
And when did you decide to move from community organizing to researching and writing? Why did you think that would be a more effective path for change? And what do you think are the one or two most influential books or reports you've written, and why?
Well, I still think of myself as a community organizer. I work at the Institute for Policy Studies. I do research, but it's very much in relationship with community organizing efforts. We just did a series of reports last year looking at luxury real estate and how it was disrupting affordable housing. And that really was rooted in the organizing work that I did in my 20s and 30s. And I still organize a lot in my spare time. We have a big pipeline fight in my own neighborhood in Boston where we fought against a frack gas pipeline, and I helped organize and train several hundred people to do direct action and civil disobedience over 2 years. We did not succeed in stopping that pipeline, but so I think of myself as still as somebody who is a community organizer. But I have been interested in how these inequalities have unfolded, and particularly the concentration of wealth at the top. And I do feel like the book Born on Third Base was important because it was really where I talked about how advantage works, how privilege and advantage were sort of passed on to me, how I reflect and think about it. And it was really my attempt to engage other people from my background, people who are in the top 1%, top 5%, and our important role in helping change society. So I would say that was a important work. And in terms of the reports, we've been doing reports on the racial wealth divide for the last couple of years. We've been looking at the way in which philanthropy is evolving and how concentrations of wealth are distorting charities and philanthropy. It's something you and I are going to talk about, I know. But we were really, Institute for Policy Studies in 2015 was really the first to put out a major report looking at what we call top-heavy philanthropy, how more and more giving is being coming from the very rich, and how small donor and middle-class donor are declining, and why that's not good for the independent charity sector. So I feel like we've had a role in kind of nudging some very, very important conversations forward.
I do want to talk to you about how that affects charity, because we can see how it's also affected the political process, where, the small donors are the anomaly, except in the case of Bernie Sanders, of course. Now let's get to these Billionaire Bonanza reports, because 2020 was not your first one. You did one in 2018, which I read, and it includes this statistic that the wealth of 3 specific families increased 6,000% since 1982, but median household wealth was down 3%. And I remember that because I was musing about what I made when I first got out of college in 1980. And when you translate it into, today's dollars, it's really not much more than people doing the same job we're doing. So I thought that didn't surprise me so much, but it was more like the 600,000. I guess that shouldn't have surprised me either, being somebody who was in the Occupy movement. But talk about the major findings of that 2018 report, and also those 3 family dynasties that you profiled.
Thanks for bringing that up, because I think when we talk about the billionaires, people often think of sort of these first generation billionaires, sort of a Jeff Bezos, a Bill Gates. But one of the things that is really important to understand is we have dynastic wealth in the United States. We have some wealthy families that are now in their 3rd generation of holding wealth, and the traditional idea is in a healthy society, people go from the saying is from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, meaning you may have somebody who starts a business, they become wealthy, but that wealth over 3 generations kind of disperses because of taxes, because of giving to charity, and because of the sheer, people have children and the wealth sort of spreads out and disperses. So how could it be that the Mars Candy family, the Waltons of Walmart, the Koch brothers, now the Koch brother and his sister-in-law, these families, several generations later, their wealth is actually accelerating. And that's where it's important to understand that these folks have have arrested that natural process of wealth dispersion. They're using their wealth and power to rig the rules to get more wealth and power. And a lot of what they're doing is they're hiding their money. They're paying wealth defense industry professionals, lawyers, and tax accountants and wealth planners to create trusts and all kinds of mechanisms that essentially mean that they, instead of paying their taxes or sharing the wealth through charity, they're actually accumulating and hoarding more and more. So I think that was one of our findings, was to say there's something wrong with this picture when wealth concentrates in fewer and fewer hands.
You know, we used to talk about how in under Reagan and even under Clinton, people paid more taxes. But I remember when we had that like 90% tax bracket or whatever it was, there were all sorts of tax loopholes then. So nobody was really paying their taxes. So I think this has been a phenomenon that wealthy people started doing even before the last, 4 decades of neoliberalism. Did you find that as well in your research?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of anecdotal, stories about the 1950s and 1960s wealthy people. I guess it was J.P. Morgan used to say, if I have to pay any taxes, I fire my accountant because they haven't been working hard enough to find all the loopholes that I should be availing myself. The reality, though, Lauren, was the richest 1%, maybe they didn't pay the statutory income tax rate of 90% above a certain level, but they paid a heck of a lot more taxes than they pay today. And so the effective tax rate, the actual percentage of your income that you paid in taxes, the richest 1% probably paid close to 60% of their income in taxes. Today, it's like 23%,
Right.
and the higher up you go, the Forbes 400, it's like, whatever, 21%.
Yeah, I know.
So even though you're right, I think people have been creating loopholes and gaming the tax system for as long as there's ever been a tax system. The games have accelerated. The avoidance, the aggressive avoidance has accelerated.
Now let's talk about your new report, Billionaire Bonanza 2020. Now this statistic was staggering. Between 1990 and 2020, the US billionaire class has seen its net worth increase over 1,130%. Meanwhile, US median household net worth between 1989 and 1916 grew by a mere 5.37%. 12 billionaire wealth has 12 billion, or maybe that was point. It was maybe.
I think that's a footnote.
That's a footnote, yeah.
Yeah.
Billionaire wealth has grown 210 times faster than median wealth. Now, this updates those figures from just 2 years ago. What are the other major findings of this report, the one we're discussing tonight?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of some longer term trends, and then there's some pandemic related trends. So, but in terms of longer term trends, the fact that 3 billionaires continue to have as much wealth as the bottom half of the entire society combined, that continues. There's still that sort of extraordinary concentration at the top. And then we looked at from 1980 to the present, what happened to billionaire taxes? And we found the taxes paid by billionaires as a percentage of their wealth went down almost 80% between 1980 and the present. That's pretty shocking. So there are sort of those longer term trends, and because it was 2020, we have 1990 data and each decile. So we sort of looked at, what is the billionaire wealth, cumulative wealth looking like? And that's the statistic you mentioned. It's accelerating. It's growing much faster than the rest of the population as a whole. Then we looked at, so how are the billionaires faring under this pandemic? Because you may remember back in, end of February, early March, we were hearing things like, oh, all this billionaire wealth is vanishing. The global billionaire class, $400 billion of wealth just evaporated. That's what we were hearing about. So we were curious to see when Forbes did their annual global billionaire issue, which came out on April 7th. How were the billionaires doing? And in fact, according to Forbes, billionaire wealth in the US was down from last year. Last year, you took all the US billionaires, they had $3.1 trillion. Now they have whatever, 9.4 trillion or 2.9 trillion. Not a huge loss, but a decline. Then we kind of kept tracking. And what we found, and part of this is the market in April was growing rapidly. And as of Thursday, so last Thursday, we looked, billionaire wealth since March 18th has gone up $406 billion. At the same time, 30 million people have lost their jobs. So again, from how is society doing? That's really bizarre that billionaire wealth is surging at a time when there's such high unemployment. And then we zeroed in on who is really seeing their wealth accelerate. And we identified 8, what we call pandemic profiteers. Jeff Bezos, Eric Yuan, the CEO of Zoom, Stephen Ballmer, who controls the wealth of Microsoft that owns Skype and Teams, and then a bunch of hedge fund managers and people in kind of the medical and pharmaceutical sectors who are seeing their wealth dramatically increase while everyone else is struggling. And we called them the pandemic profiteers.
Well, you had said in that report that Wall Street was going to rebound faster than Main Street, but Wall Street has already rebounded.
Yeah.
And this is because of the fiscal and monetary stimulus that the government and the Fed are doing that aids, banks, hedge funds, and large companies more than it's aiding Main Street. Do you think that there needs to be additional reforms, such as putting workers on corporate boards, eliminating quarterly earnings reports, restrictions on stock buybacks, elimination of carried interest loopholes, in addition to the main recommendations that you have in both of your reports, which is a wealth tax and a inheritance tax?
Yeah, I mean, first I would say that the reason I think the billionaires are doing so much better is in part not so much about the recent stimulus, although there are so many examples where that's tilted to the rich. It's just that the whole economy is wired now to funnel wealth to the top, whether there's a pandemic or not. It's heads I win, tails you lose when it comes to the rich and wealth. But you named a number of reforms that I'm in strong alignment with. There's a way in which the capitalism is wired to funnel wealth to the top. And there are things that we can intervene on a number of levels. So you mentioned expanding worker ownership of boards, creating kind of a sense of stakeholder capitalism or greater worker and community ownership of boards. So not all the rewards go to absentee shareholders. Those are some of the structural system reforms that are going to fix the machinery that right now is funneling all that wealth to the top. And several of the ones you named, I would put in that necessary list.
But your biggest recommendations, a wealth tax and an inheritance tax, I wanted to address that because I've got a lot of friends who are into modern monetary theory. And they say that when a government prints fiat currency, it really doesn't pay for its expenses with taxes. And we can see after this $2.5 trillion CARES bailout and the additional 4 to 6 trillion that they were giving to banks and hedge funds and large corporations in the form of 0% interest, that this question that they kept asking Bernie Sanders, how are you going to pay for it, is not a real question, because the government has always figured out how they can pay for things when it's their priority, such as the tax cuts or subsidies to the fossil fuel companies or these endless wars. So the question remains, does this throw your argument out about raising taxes? Or do you think that we need higher taxes on the wealthy simply because it is immoral to accumulate so much wealth?
I would argue we should be implementing those taxes to save democracy from oligarchic power. When you have 3 billionaires that have as much wealth as the bottom half of society, uh, you know, we can debate, the virtues of modern monetary theory. You do raise taxes on the wealthy in order to pay for certain things, but in this case, you're also trying to put a brake on oligarchic power in order to save democracy and from the capture by the billionaire class. uh, a progressive tax and inheritance tax is how you prevent the creation of wealth dynasties, how you slice the wealthy down to democratic size. So either way, I think whether it's moral or fiscal or from a democracy point of view, it's really in our interest to tax and break down those powerful accretions of wealth.
In the 2018 year report, you wrote, Thomas Piketty warned that the US is devolving into a patrimonial capitalism, where in the coming years, the heirs of today's billionaires will dominate our politics, culture, economy, and philanthropic sector. As wealth concentrates in fewer hands, so does the power to shape the rules governing the economy. And that's what you're talking about, the democracy. And Bernie Sanders highlighted it too, saying we have a country that is where the government and the economy are controlled by the wealthy. So that is not a democracy. In fact, the 2014 Princeton study by Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page showed that we already live in a plutocracy. They wrote, multivariate analysis indicates that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on US government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. So basically, how do you think we can change anything and get these kind of wealth taxes and other policies passed through electoral politics when there is such an outsized influence of money in politics? I mean, I met you at a meeting of Occupy Venice back in 2012. That was all about doing more radical direct action. So I basically have given up on electoral politics. After this last thing with Bernie Sanders and how they put everything against him to stop him, it seems so clear to me that they would rather, and I mean, when I say they, I mean the Democratic establishment would rather lose to Trump than win with Bernie and have all their, billionaire money put in jeopardy because of all the things Bernie would have done. I'm putting my effort into things like rent strikes and general strikes now, because I feel like we have an unparalleled opportunity that we haven't had in a century, because people are going to be unemployed. People are home right now. We can organize. And I just want to know, I know that you're also still organizing. It's like a chicken and the egg situation. We can't change anything till we get money out of politics, but we can't get money out of politics as long as we have these representatives.
Well, I share your feelings about what happened to the Sanders campaign. I also think it's great and important for people to be, not so overly focused on electoral change. It's almost like a huge distraction. And I think the thing about the Sanders movement, our revolution, was it is a social movement. It's first and foremost a social movement, and we shouldn't let the fact that Bernie's not the nominee keep us from doing all the same things that we would be doing, which is organizing protests, doing direct action, using small donations to sort of lift up, support activist agendas. I do take heart in the fact, and I think you said it, the chicken and egg, or I just sort of see us like we have these two fists and we're just jammed together: the influence of money in politics, the capture of our political system. How do we make it move at all, and I take heart in the fact that the progressive populist agenda, the Bernie Sanders agenda, raise the minimum wage, universal health insurance, Medicare for all, elimination of student debt, taxing the rich to make, public investments and save our democracy. Those are wildly popular programs. 70, 80% of the population, including Republican voters, huge number of independent voters, support that agenda. So if we can crack a little here and there, the power of money, the grip on our democracy, come out of this pandemic more resolved than ever to capture as much of the economy, protect our economy from the billionaire class, the better we'll be. The more we'll create room to move, and that not just at the presidential level, but state and local candidates. So I haven't given up entirely on electoral politics because it is a really important arena of power. But I just think we should realize, like, voting is actually not a holy act. It is 1/1000th or less of the political work we have to do. It's a tactical momentary decision, sometime in November, we need to exercise it, but we shouldn't let it distract us from all the other organizing work that we need to be doing. So that's my exhortation. And I think the Sanders campaign shows what people's small donor support can actually challenge the big money. It can give the big money a run for their money, if you will. And people power in the end is what really is going to matter.
Yeah. Let's go back and talk about charity, because like you said, you did a lot of work on charity and how it's being used, really not for giving, but more for like a tax write-off. In your new report, you wrote, the current pandemic is bringing us daily reports of compassionate billionaires making donations to charities or lending their private planes to transport medical equipment. We should all celebrate generosity, but we should also remember that for every $1
that a billionaire gives to charity, you and I chip in anywhere from 37 to 74 cents toward that donation. This is important to realize. Wealthy people are using philanthropy. In some cases, they're using it to direct money to good things, but it is a way of reducing their taxes where you and I, the rest of us, are chipping in for their pet projects. And that's why we need to fix philanthropy. We should, change the rules that govern philanthropy. Because it's not a substitute for a fair tax system, and it's not a substitute for the rich paying their fair share of taxes. And if anything, it's become kind of a distraction from what we really need to do.
Well, can you talk about how they're doing that?
A lot of people give money to charity. Many people give money without any sort of tax consequence. If you go to any neighborhood store in this country, and you'll hear about somebody who's had to have surgery, and there's a jar on the counter, and you can donate to, Tammy's operation fund. Nobody's getting a tax break for that. Low and middle income donors give to the charities in their community without keeping score and taking it off their taxes. The richer you are, the more you're likely to take a tax deduction, itemize your taxes. And then the very rich have private foundations and donor advised funds. And they put these funds into these charitable intermediaries. They get their deductions. They reduce their taxes. They reduce their income taxes, their inheritance taxes, and their capital gains taxes. So they can save up to 74 cents on every dollar by giving to a qualified charity. But in these cases, these are foundations and donor advised funds that they continue to control. So again, from a democracy point of view, these are privately funded, undemocratic extensions of their political power. So the more giving is concentrated at the top, the more it subverts the nonprofit sector, and the real spirit of charitable giving. So in our report, we talk about, here we are in a pandemic. You have all these wealthy people who are essentially warehousing all this wealth in foundations and donor advised funds. Let's mandate that Congress move the money, increase the payout, require these foundations and donor advised funds to pay out a portion of their funds every year, more than they are now. We've already paid for them with tax breaks that have already gone to the rich. So now it's like, well, let's move the money. There's tremendous needs out there. Let's get this money off the sidelines.
Now, in your 2018 report, you talked about, you said there are plenty of examples of wealthy families who choose not to aggressively preserve wealth and pass it on to next generations. Talk about Warren Buffett's giving pledge and other examples of this, some of the wealthy people that you've personally worked with. And then we'll talk about Bill Gates as a separate question.
There are people who have given substantial wealth while they're alive. Actually, the person I would lift up is a guy named Chuck Feeney, who started the duty-free shops that when you go through airports internationally, you can buy goods, and he made a huge amount of money, and he secretly wired it so that all the profits went to a charity called Atlantic Philanthropies, and they have given out $8 billion over the last 30 years, and they're closing their doors in June, meaning that they're not sitting on top of a mountain of money in perpetuity. They've moved it along, and he lives in a apartment in San Francisco, and he is 89 years old, and he's not rich anymore. He's never, so that, to me, that's an example where, there are people who've made very different choices. He's inspired people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates to create the Giving Pledge. The Giving Pledge is almost 300 rich people who've said they're going to give away all their wealth, or at least half their wealth, before they die or when they die. So it's kind of breaking with this idea that you're going to create a perpetual monument to yourself that will live on forever in the form of a charitable foundation. They're really talking about giving while living. So I think that's a good trend. I think, unfortunately, not enough of the really wealthy are doing that.
Yeah, Jeff Bezos has not signed that pledge yet, and he's the wealthiest one of all.
His ex-wife has signed it.
Yeah, that's nice. So you're mentioned in this this recent expose that Tim Schwab wrote for The Nation magazine about Bill Gates's foundation. It's a $20 billion foundation. And you were mentioned because you worked with Bill Gates Sr. in the 90s and the 2000s to set this up. But this foundation has changed, and I want to read this paragraph and get your reaction to it. Describing his approach by turns as creative capitalism and catalytic philanthropy, Gates oversaw a shift at his foundation to leverage, quote, all the tools of capitalism to, quote, connect the promise of philanthropy with the power of private enterprise. The result has been a new model of charity in which the most direct beneficiaries are sometimes not the world's poor, but the world's wealthiest, in which the goal is not to help the needy, but to help the rich help the needy. Through an investigation of more than 19,000 charitable grants the Gates Foundation has made over the past 2 decades, the nation has uncovered close to $2 billion in tax-deductible charitable donations to private companies, including some of the largest businesses in the world, such as GlaxoSmithKline, Unilever, IBM, NBC Universal Media, which are tasked with developing new drugs, improving sanitation in the developing world, developing financial products for Muslim consumers, and spreading the good news about this work. So do you think that the prominence of Bill Gates in all the news shows about COVID-19 is worrisome? Now, I don't believe all these right-wing conspiracy theories that he's responsible for spreading the pandemic, of course, but I did read a report of the World Health Organization with regards to his funding of malaria, that he was kind of taking that over and dictating in what was going to be funded and what wasn't going to be funded in terms of, treatment and prevention and whatnot. I'm just worried about where this money is going to be, or the research is going to be funded as it relates to COVID-19. Am I just being paranoid here? What is your feeling about this issue?
A couple things there. One is, I think it's more, should any private foundation have so much power in a global political system, especially when it comes to global political health or, public health? Now, I also don't harbor any of these conspiracy theories about Bill Gates. In fact, I think he's a smart guy who's been studying pandemics. He read the book, The Coming Plague. He read the research. He's been, actually publicly speaking out about how ill prepared we have been for the last couple of years to face a pandemic. He genuinely cares about public health. But the question is, should a private foundation have so much power? And that's where I was weighing in that article. I was actually reflecting on what his father used to say, which is, isn't it a problem that my son could give $100 billion to his foundation and never have to pay any taxes on that wealth? Because in reality, we should be taxing wealth, and it should be invested in national and global public health infrastructure. We keep forgetting philanthropy is not a substitute for publicly funded, whether it's international institutions, national health institutions. We need the public in the public health system. So, I think the Gates Foundation has actually done some really smart things. I think they've used their power and their wealth in other areas that haven't been constructive, like around the, sort of global green revolution, the small schools movement. It's just a problem when you have private power usurping democratic governance. That's what we need is a robust public infrastructure, like in European countries. Even Vietnam is doing better than the United States in responding to COVID-19 because they put in place a very robust public health infrastructure, and they also have more centralized responses. Here in the United States, we got 50 states and 50 governors, and a couple of them are real wackos, and now we're going to have this patchwork of a response.
Well, I want to close the show talking about values, because I was asking you in the very first question how you got your values and your social conscience. And I want to just wrap it up by talking a little bit about my situation, because I relate to you a lot. I grew up also in a very wealthy family, but they had different values, I guess, as your parents did as well, and passed them on to me. I think my father was very much influenced by FDR's New Deal and Harry Truman's Fair Deal. I was influenced also by my grandfather, who was a capitalist. He started a business in the Depression. It was a clothing manufacturing business. And then my father took it over when he got ill. And my grandfather retired and ended up being a philanthropist and an author. He published 3 books. Kind of reminds me of me doing my own show, sort of at the same age when he was publishing his books and writing his opinions on politics and government. But I feel like my values were very much influenced by also my time. I was a kid in the late 60s, early 70s, where I think the value system was a lot different than it was in the 80s. And I also went to college that was known for, radical political activism, the kinds of books that I read when I was growing up, the whole 9 yards. But then in the 80s, I think things kind of changed. It was the onset of 40 years of neoliberalism. There was a movie made during that decade called Wall Street, where Gordon Gekko played a Wall Street trader, and he had a great speech in there in which he said, "Greed is good." And the movie was supposed to be a satire, but a lot of people took it seriously and they aspired to be like Gordon Gekko.
Right.
But, it's not just the 80s, it's also our entire American history of, rugged individualism, the Horatio Alger myth that anybody by working hard can pull themselves up from their bootstraps. When we know now that there is no social mobility, people are likely to die into the very social class that they were born into. So you and I have been talking a lot about how we change policy, but what I want to talk about is how do we change values in the culture and within our families, because that seems to me very foundational. How do we get away from individualism and move more towards collectivism? How do we get away from competition and move towards solidarity? I know you must have thought about this a lot over your lifetime, and you must have had conversations with other wealthy people that you were trying to change. Because I don't know a lot of wealthy people that think like this, that reflect like this. In fact, most of them I can think about are very sociopathic in terms of how much they still think they need and are entitled to, even though they have more than they could ever spend an entire lifetime. So what are your closing thoughts about changing values? And have you had any success in doing so?
Well, there's a lot there that you said, Lauren. I think one thing is people tell themselves stories about the sources of wealth. There's a sort of what I call a narrative that holds these inequalities in place, which if I were to put it on a bumper sticker is everyone is where they deserve to be. And the wealthy feel like, well, our wealth is deserved. Somebody in our family worked hard and created this wealth. And the problem with these other people over here is they are deficient in some way. And that first step is we have to change that story. We have to understand there's a web, there's a commonwealth, there's no one does it alone. People who have great wealth may have some special spark or gift, but they didn't get there on their own. So that's part of it. I think that you use the word solidarity, but I think there is a sort of very important value there, which is recognizing we are in it together. And coming out of whatever spiritual tradition people come from, is just seeing we're one body, we're interconnected. An injury to you is an injury to me. And I think a lot of wealthy people have I say privilege is a disconnection drug. They're living disconnected from others. They don't see the ways in which privilege creates barriers to their connecting with others, being in a community of exchange and reciprocity. Those are so I think understanding we're in it together, that these extreme inequalities actually undermine the quality of life for everyone, including those of us who are privileged. It's not in anyone's interest to kind of keep going down this road. So I think that the way I think about it, and I wrote about it in Born on Third Base, is it's time to invite our fellow brothers and sisters in the 1% to come home, to bring their wealth home, to put it back in communities. And the good news, Lauren, is actually there are quite a few people who get that. There's a whole generation of younger wealthy people connected to this resource generation network who are really thoughtful and questioning how privilege and advantage works. There's the Patriotic Millionaires Network, hundreds of business leaders and wealthy individuals stepping out into the media publicly, calling for fair taxes, living wages. So I think there is a movement that will support all the other movements as they push forward and work toward a more fair society.
Well, that's a lovely way to end the show. And I really want to thank you very much for being on, even though you were in the dark the whole time.
I know.
I think you were in the dark, but you've enlightened a lot of us. I want to just let people know that my next show is going to be on Wednesday, and it's going to be with Bob Kuttner, who is the co-founder of the American Prospect. I've had his other co-founder on my show, Dave Dayan, before. And Bob is going to be discussing his latest article, the zombie invasion of Team Biden, about how he's appointing people like, well, consulting with people like Larry Summers and all these people who so got it wrong during the Obama administration, and what his administration is going to look like, because they say, you know, personnel is policy. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight and ask you to please share this show. Thank you again for being on the show, Chuck, and thank you for all your life's work.
Thanks, Lauren, for having me.
Great. And I want to tell everyone to stay safe, stay home, and keep fighting.